Hello and welcome to this week's Industry Insights. I'm your host, Leah Troscianecki, and I'm joined today by Jeff Reichard, one of my other co-hosts, and we are going to be having a very special episode of Industry Insights because we are going to be talking all things financial services. You know, one of the nice things about Veeam is that it really is an applicable solution for any kind of organization that we work with. But we recognize that there are some unique needs that each kind of organization is having to contend with. And especially as we're tracking a lot of trends in the space, Jeff, I think there's a lot of things that are uniquely impacting financial services organizations that we're excited to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Leah, as you know, and as I think a lot of our long-term viewers will know, I work a lot both with our enterprise customers, but I also work with a lot of our solution provider partners. And I can tell you that the effect that ransomware in particular has had on the financial services industry has been leading to a lot of adjustment in that space. And it has also been leading to a lot of regulation for our customers, both in the United States and in the EU in the financial services space.
Absolutely. And certainly, I think we recognize that there are a lot of regulations that are coming up in each geography. But we also recognize that a lot of organizations operate in multiple geographies. So it's good, regardless of where your headquarters might be, to be aware of some of these regulations. Obviously, we're not going to be the first ones to tell you about these regulations if you're in the financial services space. But what we do want to talk about is kind of our unique perspective from the data protection standpoint. And I think we'll also highlight some of the things that we think Veeam can help with when it comes to your organization's efforts to stay compliant. But let's go ahead and just first start with some table stakes, Jeff, and talk a little bit about some of those challenges that are facing financial services when it comes to data and the regulations around data management.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, when I talk with our VAR partners, when I talk with systems integrators all over the world, they are looking quite a bit these days at an act that has recently been passed in the European Union. It was passed actually back in November of 2022, and it will fully go into effect in January of next year. And that's called Dora, the Digital Operations and Resiliency Act. And Dora specifically regulates, I'll just share one more acronym. Dora specifically regulates information and communication technology. So if you ever read any article about the act or text about it, you'll see ICT, that acronym, being used quite a bit because that's what it focuses on. And as you might guess by the name, what Dora is attempting to do throughout the European Union is to standardize the digital operational resilience for information and communication technologies. And the goal, of course, is to prevent cyber attacks, whether ransomware, whether nation state, whatever they may be, to providing really big systemic disruption in this space, to actually stopping financial services and really disrupting life for member states. So that's the goal of the act. And again, it's gone most of the way through the process now, was initially passed back in 2022 and needs to be fully implemented by January of next year.
So those kind of implications are coming in hot for a lot of organizations. Could you maybe break down a little bit some of the key areas that Dora focuses on that we think these kind of teams need to be aware of when it comes to data protection?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a slide for this one, basically talking about what Dora is. Again, the focuses for Dora in order to show in order to enhance digital resiliency are around a couple of areas. They're around information and communication technologies, risk management, that is, financial services organizations need to establish strict requirements about identifying and managing their own risks and mitigating the ones that are beyond where they ought to be in terms of management. The Dora Act also has some things that we've seen in other recent cybersecurity legislation. Namely, it has incident reporting mandates. Um, you have to report what's called significant incidents within a mandatory time period. What we've seen with mandatory incident reporting here in the United States, as an example, because the SEC implemented that a couple of years ago, is that it has driven a lot of virtuous behavior from organizations quickly and transparently reporting attacks, whereas maybe before that's not something that they would have done. The benefit of that is that any lingering hopes that perhaps senior management might have had that if you get attacked, you can just try to fix it on the quiet and sweep it under the rug goes away, because there are real teeth in the legislation about making sure that you comply with the legislation. In addition to mandatory timely incident reporting, the Act also mandates digital operational resilience testing. So you have to test frequently, and you have to be able to tell regulators how resilient you're going to be against cyber threats based on that testing. Another theme that the Act deals with, and again, this is one that we have seen a lot in some recent events that have taken place around ransomware, is third-party risk management. We are a connected world. Leah, I know you see the statistics that we have from Veeam's own research about how hybrid most of our customers' environments are. And Dora, like a lot of other regulation in this space, is requiring that you get a grip on your suppliers and make sure that you're not exposed to third-party risk, that you're not just managing your own risk, but you're managing the risk that you take on based on the partners that you're doing business with as a financial services entity.
I think it really takes that shared responsibility model to a whole new level. Obviously, shared responsibility models are so common with cloud services, SaaS offerings. So we recognize the idea of, yes, it is your data, you need to be responsible for it. But when you see these kinds of regulations in place and the expectations on the owners of the data, right, it becomes a really interesting game to figure out when you take on and assume third-party risk versus when you might need to store something back in a data center for those kinds of control purposes. So I think this is definitely something that we're going to continue to track. But, one of the layers of this is, we're talking about financial services as if it's a monolithic idea, right? That all financial services companies are the same. Do you want to talk a little bit about how Dora uniquely affects different kinds of financial services organizations?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So if we talk about who the regulation, the legislation actually is pointed toward, the umbrella that covers financial services entities is a huge one. First off, credit institutions. If you're a bank, if you're a financial institution that offers credit, that loans, has credit cards, anything like that, then you're going to be covered by this. If you are a service provider that handles digital payments, and we've all encountered that when you go to a retail establishment and you use your card with a third-party provider's hardware or software running on something like a tablet, those are payment institutions. And of course, they're financial services institutions. They have, for a long time, been subject to the same kind of privacy and information security legislation that's been out there, for example, in the payment card industry forever. But now they're being brought under the exact same kind of legislation that affects banks, that affects electronic money transfer organizations. There are many kinds of organizations that handle that, both person to person and business to business. Those are also going to be covered under the DORA legislation. But let's step back just a little bit from sort of the more immediate transactional kinds of financial services. Investment firms, right? If I'm an investment firm, I'm also providing financial services. That kind of organization, stock exchanges, commodities trading organizations, futures trading organizations, have been regulated separately and often country by country for years. But what DORA does is impose an EU-wide framework, at least around operational resiliency, for that kind of organization as well. But of course, it doesn't end there. There are crypto asset service providers, which for many organizations, for many individuals, are very important holders of their assets. There are insurers and reinsurers, which are some of the longest tenured and most significant players in the financial services industry, especially in the EU. We have insurance companies that have been around literally for many hundreds of years. And now their practices around operational resiliency are going to be brought into the fold in terms of EU-wide regulation. That's kind of important because at least until the Change Healthcare cyber attack, which happened earlier this year, if we change focus a little bit to the United States, one of the biggest ransomware payments that had been made in the United States, in excess of $20 million, was made by an insurance company in Chicago that got hit by ransomware a couple of years ago. So obviously, it's pretty important that they be the same. Now, continuing the long list of people who are affected by this, securities depositories and counterparties, trading venues, stock exchanges, all that sort of area, third-party service providers, other financial market participants, which is lots and lots of different third-party service providers that work with financial firms. And so if you think about it, if you're a financial services firm anywhere in the world that does business with the EU, if you're a service provider to a financial services company anywhere in the world, anywhere part of that long list, as we talked about just a minute ago, Leah, those requirements are going to perk down to you as well. So it's really kind of like we saw with GDPR, which drove a whole virtuous cycle of privacy-oriented behavior all over the world for organizations that did business with data subjects in the EU. We're going to be seeing kind of the same thing with respect to organizations doing business with that long list of covered financial services entities in the EU based on this regulation.
Far-reaching for sure. And I think it's really important to then not panic, right? Stay calm and figure out what you can do about this, right? So Jeff, you spent a lot of time talking with these kinds of organizations. What are some of the steps that they're taking to try to tackle this compliance as we're heading towards the deadline?
Well, it's a big job. And it is such a big job. To give you an example, there are a lot of global systems integrators that are based in the EU or have significant operations in the EU. There are global systems integrators based in the United States and in India that also do business with a lot of organizations in the EU. There is not a single one of those. I'm talking about the Kyndryls, the Capgeminis, the TCSs, the list goes on, of big systems integrator companies that doesn't have a practice based around helping financial services organizations get ready for Dora compliance. Some of the steps that they are helping financial services organizations do, first, conducting gap analysis, looking at where your current cybersecurity and resilience practices are, and then figuring out how they stack up against the requirements, again, that come January of next year, which is right around the corner, organizations are going to be subject to. Figure out what the areas are that you need to improve. One of the nice things about Dora, and we've been seeing this increasingly in the cyber regulatory environment over the last couple of years, is that it's very much focused on risk. It used to be more so that the whole cybersecurity framework that organizations dealt with, the practices that they dealt with, tended to be focused on long lists of controls and spreadsheets without as much of an idea of what the appetite for risk in the organization overall was, without as much of a focus on what the actual risks to the organization from a business perspective were and how you should be mitigating those. One of the nice things about Dora is that it does focus specifically on risk management. It invites organizations and requires organizations to develop a fairly comprehensive risk management set of policies and procedures, figure out exactly where they stand, assess how significant the various risks to them on the cyber side are, and then mitigate those risks. One of the goals, additionally, with the legislation, and we've seen this, I think, in a lot of different types of organizations in response to the whole ransomware threat is to foster a culture focused on resilience. One thing, Leah, I know you've had a lot of talks with our partners and customers, and the truth is that cybersecurity is a team sport, and it's very much something that you need to build a culture around, right?
Yeah, it really is. And I think, again, looking to outside partners who understand kind of what's uniquely facing a lot of these organizations can help, especially when it comes to incident response, because I think that so many organizations don't want to share what happened to them, right? There's a sort of brand protection that a lot of these organizations want to maintain, especially in these highly regulated industries like financial services. So going to outside vendors who are able to discreetly collect a lot of these, signals and behaviors of the bad actors, it can really make a big difference because, as you said, cybersecurity is a team sport, but a lot of the times these organizations want to hide in the shadows. So we could band together, or we can work with some of these outside partners. And of course, Veeam is really proud to work with Coveware now as part of the Veeam family, and they are really known as experts in the space. And again, in particular, they have one of the largest databases of signals in the cybersecurity space. So I think this is just yet another way that a lot of organizations can kind of step up their game. But that's on the services side. I think what we could do now is talk a little bit about the tech, because, when we recognize that cyber is a team sport, so much of it is people, process, and tech, right? So let's maybe get into the tech and talk a bit about some of Veeam's capabilities that can help organizations with Dora.
Yeah, would absolutely love to do that. So when we talk about Dora specifically, there are several articles. Like most legislation, it's divided up into different provisions, different articles. One of those that we have been speaking with our partners and with our financial services customers about is Article 9, which talks about protection of your information and communication technologies and prevention of attacks. Article 10 talks about the detection, the cyber detection that you have in place. Article 12, obviously right in Veeam's wheelhouse, talks about backup policies and restoration and recovery. And Article 25, also near and dear to us, talks about the testing of ICT tools and systems. As anyone who has tuned in to our regular Tuesday Industry Insights broadcasts and our Thursday Tech Bites broadcasts knows, we've got a lot of different capabilities that can help with all of these around protection and prevention, especially with the additional ransomware resilience, ransomware detection, malware detection capabilities that we put into the product in the last year in version 12 and 12.1, and most recently in 12.2, which just came out. We've really stepped up the ability to protect information and communication technology systems. That's very important, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more around backup. But what we've seen with threat actors, and those of you who tune in to these live streams frequently have heard this a lot from our research, they basically will invariably not just attack production systems, but they'll also attack your data protection systems. And so it's important that when you're thinking about Article 9 around protection, you're not just thinking about protection of the working environment, but you're also thinking about protection of the resiliency environment that you've put in place. Detection, the malware detection that Veeam has, both for malware in backups, malware attacks on production systems, but maybe most importantly, threat actor attacks on the backup infrastructure is critical. We have reporting and alerting, which is called out here, that does a great job of interfacing with our financial services customers' existing security tooling. We can do that both by syslog integration. We can do it by our Veeam incident API that can both send actions and receive actions to and from the security frameworks that are out there. And then if we talk about backup and recovery, obviously Veeam has led in this space for quite a long time. And one of the nice things about the capabilities that we've got, particularly around cyber, are that we make it very easy for organizations to recover workloads of different criticality levels at different speeds. So you can tailor your recovery point, recovery time objectives according to what the actual workload is. And again, getting back to the whole risk management process, how critical it is for the business. And Leah, as you know, Article 25, which talks about testing of ICT tools and systems, has been near and dear to Veeam for quite a long time.
Definitely. I think that testing piece is so important because, especially when we're talking about this team sport concept, people, process tech, documentation, reporting, it's the boring day two stuff, but those are some of the elements that really increase the confidence. And again, when you're talking about that risk appetite, I think it's really important to recognize that there are kind of dials that can be turned to make everybody feel more comfortable with the risk that they are assuming. Because at the end of the day, these are all best practices that we really want organizations to be pushing. But there are time, money, et cetera, other factors that go into making these day-to-day decisions. So focusing on testing and documentation, I think there's a reason we're so passionate about it. Something else that I think we're really passionate about from the risk side is recognizing that it isn't just about your tier one workloads, as you said, right? So taking a look at having a confident backup and recovery strategy across your environment, regardless of where those workloads resides, can be really key. Again, especially as we recognize that so often in these kinds of ransomware attacks, they're trying to find as many points of entry as possible. So when you look at something like our malware detection, which again, just to kind of break that apart a little bit, one of the beautiful things about our malware detection is that you're able to take a look at what is happening with your backup infrastructure and identify anomalous activity. So we're actually seeing in some cases that anomalous activity at the backup level is becoming an early signal, right? I think we look at backup and recovery as something that's later in the cyber resilient strategy. They say, oh, okay, great, you've got, all of these things to detect, to figure out containment strategies in the event that malware has gotten in and other factors have gotten in. But being able to actually look at backups as an early signal to get proactive, I think is key. And especially when you're looking at backup of lots of different workloads, it just adds signals to the equation to hopefully keep your organization ahead of these bad actors. So lots of really great things to kind of break apart within the Veeam capability set. But I want to go ahead and kind of flip this a little bit, Jeff, and talk a bit about anything besides Dora, because I think we've spent a lot of time talking about Dora in particular, and it can become an example of where other regulations are going to go moving forward in other geographies. So are there any regulations that we should be talking about right now in the financial services space?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And one of the things that we've seen, and we saw this, I mentioned GDPR earlier. One of the things that we saw with GDPR is that it led to a lot of virtuous behavior globally, but it also led to some fairly similar regulation, unfortunately not uniform here in the United States, for example, the way that it is in the EU. But what we've seen as an example here in the United States, one of the states in the United States that has a giant amount of banking activity, of course, is New York State. The city of New York is a huge financial center. It has been for many years. New York Stock Exchange, numerous large banks have headquarters or major branches there, the insurance industry, et cetera, et cetera. The New York Department of Financial Services actually enacted a regulation back in 2017, which they refer to as Part 500 or the cybersecurity regulation in their documentation. And it began to establish cybersecurity rules for organizations that were doing business as financial services entities in New York State. That has been subsequently amended twice, once in 2020 and most recently in November of 2023. And what's interesting about that is that we see a lot of convergence with the same kind of regulations that we've got in Dora. In some senses, it's actually a bit more strict because it requires, for example, auditing. One of the things that the New York Department of Financial Services regulations require as well and this has been in place for a while now, is that every organization have a chief information security officer. So a function that is able to report to the board, that's at a very senior level in the organization, that's handling this kind of cyber resiliency requirement, this kind of cyber resiliency need for the financial services industry. And what I think we're going to see with this regulation in New York State, which, by the way, has basically been adopted almost entirely identically by the state of California. So it's at this point governing a lot of financial services entities across the United States. But what we're going to see, I think, globally is the same kind of convergence of cybersecurity standards and digital resilience standards for regulated financial services entities that we're seeing in other industries, and that we're seeing, again, with the example of privacy and personal information ruling with GDPR.
Yeah, and I think, GDPR is really important to keep bringing up because it becomes kind of a blueprint of where we think regulations are going to go. We just saw how pervasive GDPR became, again, on this privacy side and putting the onus on the organizations who own the data. I think we can kind of see where some things are going. So something I want to end with is one of our favorite topics as we're heading into Q4, and that's around planning for the next year, right? We know that January date is coming up. We can see where some of these regulations are going. So what advice do you have for some of these financial services organizations as we're heading into 2025?
So one of the things that the Dora regulation really stresses is mandatory reporting. And this is something that we've seen in some other regulation. You and I have talked about other industries recently as well. But mandatory reporting drives a lot of virtuous behavior. In particular, it drives incident response plans. If I am forced to report to my regulator within 24 or 72 hours, if I have a significant cyber incident, that means that I need to have practiced what I'm going to do if I do have that kind of incident. And as we know, and you mentioned Coveware before, we've worked with Coveware, we've worked with our customers on this planning. And if you're fortunate enough not to have been through an attack, and if you haven't gone through significant planning with all the contingencies, what do you do if your subject matter experts in one or two critical areas are backpacking in the mountains and you can't get them at the time that you are attacked? What do you do if all of your internal information communication systems are compromised and you need to stand up an entire new communication framework from scratch? What do you do if your building security systems are down and you're in a regulated industry that requires those to be up and to document who goes where and who has access to data centers? What are you going to do about making sure that outside counsel, for example, is involved in all your communications when you're responding to the incident, so that those communications are privileged and are not out there to be part of a fishing expedition if you get sued after the incident? All these kinds of things are things folks need to be crisp on and need to be aware of, and you can't be crisp on them unless you've practiced repeatedly. So my number one piece of advice, because it helps with everything else, is get really serious about your incident response planning and testing and tabletop exercises, because that's going to really expose to you where maybe you're not quite ready and not quite as resilient as you need to be.
It takes a village, right? And that's where so much of this comes in, is recognizing that we need to be sharing these best practices, that we need to be trying to stay ahead of these regulation changes that are coming. And of course, us on the vendor side at Veeam, this is something that we're going to continue to be tracking. So thank you so much for joining us as we kind of talk through some of these regulation changes that we've seen over the last year or so. Again, looking ahead to 2025 as well. Well, Jeff, I am sure that the audience, especially anyone who came from the financial services space, really appreciated the time today. It does take a village of us on the vendor side, you all on the organization side. We have a tremendous partner ecosystem as well. It takes all of us banding together to try to stay ahead of these expectations, and also to stay ahead of so many of the bad actors that we see in this space in particular. So thank you so much again, Jeff, for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the conversation, Leah.
Absolutely. And we will catch you all on the next episode of Industry Insights.